Before we teach consent, y'all need to unlearn entitlement. The problem isn't just figuring out when someone says yes, but confronting why you feel entitled to that yes in the first place. While we talk a lot about consent, we're often missing a part of the big picture. Entitlement. The world should bend to my will just because of who I am. It's basically going, I deserve this and I shouldn't have to work for it. I just deserve it. Hey, y'all. It's been quite an interesting time this year for so many reasons, but there's a lot of things that have been put on my radar that I'm just excited to talk about. This week's podcast episode is going to be a little bit different. I've been marinating on something very specific, but in marinating on that specific thing, what I noticed is that more things came up in trying to unpack it, see how it's been floating about society. And you're probably like, what the hell is she even talking about? I'm talking about entitlement, but specifically when it comes to male entitlement. There's been so much stuff that I've observed lately, had clients and friends bring to me, and things that I've actually noticed in my own life that spawned me wanting to talk about this. So sit back, relax, and we're going to take a little bit of a journey here. Of course, there'll be a little bit of astrology sprinkled in here, but just wanted to make it known that we're going to take a journey today. We're going to look into the dynamics and phenomenon of male entitlement. Stay tuned for another episode of the Spiritual Gangsta Certified podcast. Let's go.
You're now tuned into Spiritual Gangsta Certified with Illy Bish.
Okay, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of the Spiritual Gangsta Certified podcast. My name is Janae Jones, also sometimes going by Illy or Philadelphia Vish. So today we're going to get into something that's been on my mind a lot lately. And by lately, I don't even just mean the last couple days or the last couple weeks or anything like that. It's actually been on my mind a lot longer. At this point, years. Yes, years. And honestly, that's because things have been more and more on my radar when it comes to men. Now, some of you might recall years ago when Chiron first went into Aries, one of the things that I mentioned is its impact on men. And if you hear that, you hear me lighten up my blood. This subject matter kind of gives me a little anxiety. Just a tad, just a shmish. So, as a medical marijuana patient in the great state of Pennsylvania, I'm going to medicate while we talk about this. Now, when I brought up Chiron and Aries stuff, I think a lot of people were confused. It's not like we've been without some sort of glimpse into what's happening with men for a little while now, right? But as we speak today, what we're seeing is more and more mentions of something called a male loneliness epidemic, as well as a bunch of other stuff. So this has been gradually building over time. And even before 2018, and when I reflect on my life, a lot comes up when it comes to male entitlement. So I really feel like this is at the very root of so many issues that we see in our society. So the idea itself of entitlement, and specifically male entitlement, is what this is about. So this really popped on my radar to talk about again, because I've had the idea before but kind of put it off. It was sparked by a meme that came up in my memories on my personal page. Okay? And I actually reposted it to the Spiritual Gangsta Certified Facebook page. And it says, before we teach consent, y'all need to unlearn entitlement. The problem isn't just figuring out when someone says yes, but confronting why you feel entitled to that yes in the first place. If this is confusing to anybody off rip, the first thing that should probably be coming to mind for you is consent when it comes to like sexual consent. Now, I mean, there's a lot of different ways for people to consent to things, but I was focusing primarily on this, especially because we've lived through, when did that start? When did the Me Too era really begin? I know Jupiter was in Scorpio. That is one of the things that I remember, but here I go forgetting the year. Maybe it was 2017, I think. But, you know, as more women started to speak about their experiences, a shift literally happened in society. And if you look back on it, you can see it more clearly. I was just watching a video the other day about women talking about how men don't approach them when they're out. They don't meet men when they're outside because men no longer approach them. And I was also watching male responses to this, in which case someone said something to the effect of, well, we don't, because y'all said y'all don't like that. And it caused too many problems. Now, I'm not a fan of extremes because it makes people miss out on nuance. You know, when people live at extremes, as a lot of polarized people do, we're missing important things. And I'm like, I don't think the major goal was to never have a man say anything to any woman ever again out. But we do see that there was traction because women spoke up about their experiences. And since that time, a lot of different things have developed, and we've gone through a time frame where we have even more red pill podcasts. But then we also have even more pink pill podcasts in response to things. But hearkening back to that meme, when I read it, it was kind of like a little light bulb went off in discussion because of the things I've been seeing lately, some of the conversations even I've been having lately. So with my own personal experiences and those conversations that I've been having, it made me realize that while we talk a lot about consent, which is incredibly important, don't let me make it seem like it isn't, we're often missing a part of the big picture. It's almost like kind of putting a Band-Aid on a wound without ever really cleaning it out. This is why I needed a blunt. The wound, from my perspective, is entitlement. So this is what made me want to unpack entitlement in general. But we're going to explore what male entitlement really looks like, where it comes from, how it shows up in everyday life, and most importantly, what can we do about it? So, listen, I'm not trying to just point fingers at people and bash men, but I think it's important that we discuss this honestly, since this affects all of us. And nothing about it will really ever change unless there's understanding. And if we don't get to the root of things, there's no understanding. I just want to talk about entitlement in general, right? So what does it mean when we talk about entitlement? This word does get thrown around a lot. But honestly, you have to be aware of the key difference between having healthy self-esteem and having a sense of entitlement, because those two things are not the same, though things about them on the outside may appear to be. So, healthy self esteem is something that definitely emanates from within. It's internal confidence. It kind of says, I can do this if I work at it. Or it's the basic belief that you're worthy of respect just like every other person, right? The value that you place on yourself is what's the root for a healthy sense of self-esteem, right? So you have to value yourself. And that means you also have to value others. It's something that fosters connection and equality. So it's interesting how, like, okay, yes, the word self is in it. You are responsible for your self-esteem, but it doesn't really work if we're not thinking about it in relationship to others. Because no matter what we may feel individually, we are not islands. That's so cliched to say, but I swear to God, we got to remind people we're not islands. Your actions have impact. You have impact. But on the other hand, if we look at entitlement, it's all about external demands. So it's kind of like saying it's a corrosive belief because it's basically going, I deserve this and I shouldn't have to work for it. I just deserve it. Or the world should bend to my will just because of who I am. And depending on who is saying that, you can imagine it has different levels of ridiculousness. There are people that are allowed to be entitled in society because they have a certain status or power or position or wealth or something like that. And in those cases, it still can rub you the wrong way, but people will make excuses for those individuals because, yeah, maybe they did accomplish something. Maybe there are things that they put some hard work into, but a sense of entitlement, it comes across a certain way, right? So psychologists define it as having an unreasonable expectation of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations. When you think about yourself and your behavior in relationship to other people, if you have an unreasonable expectation of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with your expectations, well, goddamn, who are you? Anybody who has had the misfortune of having to be around entitled people, and like, let's say it's in a situation where you don't really have any choice, like when you go to work. I mean, you're not around the people you work primarily because you want to be around those specific people. You're around the people that you work with because y'all just happen to work at the same job. So in a work situation specifically, it's maddening. You don't really want to be around that person. And if they are expecting you to just comply with their expectations, and let's not look at it like I'm just talking about work rules. What if they're just personally an asshole? So, and then are above you in status at work, so that just adds to the unreasonable expectations they have. You know, so what we're talking about here is not just about like wanting things, wanting good treatment, wanting a better life, wanting to have access to certain things. It's really a deep-seated belief that you are simply owed them just for existing almost. Now, people argue about this. I've seen it. Especially when it comes to people being decent to other human beings. I see people ask all the time, do you think that every human being should have food and shelter just for living? Because the argument there is, oh, well, those are handouts. There's a lot of different discord about this, right? I am a compassionate human being who I don't want to see people starve. So I'll do what I can to help with that. But when we're talking about feeling owed from an entitled standpoint, what oftentimes happens is most people are not going to bend to these people's will, especially if they're not a person of note or some other category of person which somehow gives them this automatic like pass so that they can actually be a terrible human being to other people with their entitlement. But what happens is because the world doesn't often deliver on those expectations that the entitled person has, the reaction from them is not just, oh, I'm disappointed. Nope. It comes out as anger, resentment, and oftentimes they feel like they got cheated. Now, anybody can have these traits. This is not gender specific. This does not, come from a specific area. You do not have to be from a specific place to experience this. Like, it's a human thing. So a lot of us have seen it a lot. But I did definitely want to focus on how this shows up with men, because society has created a system that specifically nurtures and validates male entitlement. Sure, some of y'all have seen this. Okay, now I gotta light a blunt again, y'all. Keeps going out because I'm talking. But this shit stresses me out. I'm joking and half not. So what we're looking at here at its core is entitlement is often linked to narcissism. And I don't just mean some like misapplied version of narcissism that's, oh, it's somebody who likes to look in a mirror. No, we're talking about a psychological pattern where any failure or setback isn't seen as a chance to learn, but it's like a deeply pressed, deeply felt personal injustice. Think for a minute about people you've met in your lifetime who act like that. Entitled people tend to have very fragile egos and especially low self-esteem. So, but what I'm saying is, it is interesting and sad simultaneously, but underneath all of the demand for special treatment lies that fragile ego and low self-esteem. So in essence, it's like entitlement can be looked at like it's a suit of armor, kind of protecting this like vulnerable person inside who basically really doesn't have great self-esteem. So this is why sometimes you see what's called narcissistic rage when we relate it back to narcissism, when there's a completely over-the-top reaction. Like the anger is so over the top when expectations aren't met, and that anger doesn't match what actually has occurred. So we see that a lot. And I might have told y'all before, I feel like I have just been in school for like 13, 14 years reading the work of Professor Sam Vaknin, some other experts too, but his primarily I have the most extensive exposure to. And wow, have I seen this come up, not just in people who have actual narcissistic personality disorder, which you have to be diagnosed with, but anybody can have narcissistic traits and not necessarily have NPD. So there's that. Those angry like reactions are literally for them like a massive threat to their entire sense of self. Hence why they take it so personally. But this mindset often gets wired in during childhood. So sometimes it comes from being overindulged, where a child is protected really from any negative feelings or situations, especially something like shame. People do not realize how important a sense of shame is. It's funny because I can tell those that do understand how important a sense of shame is, because they're all asking, can we please bring it back on certain issues? So A lot of y'all are aware, but shame really is an important emotion because it teaches humility. And it also lets us know that we've crossed the line so that we can learn to respect boundaries. So, if when you're a child, you're kind of taught or molded to avoid shame at all costs, oh, that's kind of nightmarish. It's like never developing an internal like break when it comes to feeling entitled. You just think you deserve. Think of how toddler-esque that is. Think of actual babies. I say this all the time, you guys. It is not coincidental that we have Mars returns. Our first one. A return is when a planet goes back to where it was when you were born. The planet Mars, which rules things like anger, your assertion, your intellect. Okay, how you go for things, how you fight, how you excuse my French fuck. Or what kind of penis you like. Or what kind of penis you have. There's so many things here. There are. But that planet very much speaks to how a person, puts themselves forward. Mars rules Aries, so you can think of some Aries energy when you think of this. But essentially what I'm saying is, if you are around the age of 2.5 the first time you have a Mars return, think of how toddlers act. What do? They have a sense of entitlement. They are learning they are separate from their caregiver. They can now, most times they're moving about. Hopefully, if they're healthy, they're asserting themselves. They say no a lot. Different things like that. So what I'm saying is, you have that, your first Mars return when you're 2.5 years old. And if there's any, usually parents are starting really to enforce boundaries very specifically for the toddler safety. They've already been doing this. You protect your babies. There's all types of latches, locks, gates, all these sorts of things to protect children that young, because their assertion is such that they're going to go for it. So, if a child is never taught the important things about shame, they grow up believing they're special, they deserve everything, without ever learning how to handle failure or feel compassion for others truly. And again, very narcissistic. So, because of conversations that I have been having and seeing happen, I wanted to talk about how this is specific when it comes to men. This is not something I feel like should be hard to grasp. But what I'm finding and what made me want to talk about it is conversing with different women about trying to explain this to men. And why it feels like you would rather... What did I read somebody say? They will... This is rather crass, but I kind of like the way the girl put it. She would rather drag her naked coochie over broken glass than ever attempt that again. And I said, well, damn. That's one hell of a statement. But it does, I think, encapsulate how difficult it's been to have a lot of discussions that I don't really think should be that difficult to have. But I've been reminded of several things. People oftentimes, unless something affects or impacts them, they're not going to see it in a truly profound way. It's not going to mean as much to them as it would if they were directly impacted. It's just not. It's men live in a male-centered society and a patriarchy. Well, why would a lot of them care? Which is why when women say a lot of men lack empathy, that's what they're saying. When women say that a lot of men don't view women as people, actual people, this is what they mean. So we can kind of look back at where it began. Where did this sense of male entitlement come from? So specifically for men, It isn't just a psychological quirk that happened in, a handful of families. Because of the way society is set up, it's an inheritance passed down through a system that's been in place for like 5,000 years. Okay, the patriarchy. So we need to cover this. And also, I did slightly cover some aspects of this in asking if the high value man myth was a lie, where I covered like some historical origins of marriage and such. So I'll link that in the description because it's pertinent. But for a long time in hunter-gatherer societies, things were relatively equal. But when the agricultural revolution happened and people started settling down and owning land, power started to shift. Men, who often did the heavy labor of plowing and hunting, gained control over the resources, especially the food. This economic power gradually led to women being pushed into domestic roles, which were seen as less valuable. Now, the first real evidence we have of women being treated as fundamentally different and less than comes from ancient Mesopotamia, about 5,000 years ago. So in these early city-states, leaders needed a large population to grow food, build things, and fight wars. This put a huge pressure on women to have more and more children, especially sons. So women's bodies became a resource for the state and the family. And this essentially cemented a hierarchy where men were the actors and owners and women were the property. Okay? Hope everybody's following me thus far. But this brings us to marriage. For most of history, marriage was definitely, most certainly not about love. It was basically an economic deal. It was the main way to transfer property, money, and kind of like one historian bluntly put it, women. A woman's ability to have children, especially sons, to inherit property was her most critical asset. So legally, under systems like coverture in English law, a married woman basically ceased to exist as a legal person. So she couldn't own property or sign contracts and was literally covered, had the covering of her husband's identity. Now, listen, I'm not going to sit here and act like that. I think that was just great for women and I'm so glad it happened or something like that. But one of the things I try to do when I'm looking at this stuff, because like I remember first learning some of this, it just making me really pissed off and mad because, what? Your personhood did not count. Your humanity was not recognized. You did not, you fulfilled a role, and by fulfilling that role, it was formed and defined in a very particular legal way that is disrespectful as all fuck. I try to remember to remain objective about this and not get so mad because I feel like part of the reason why I even wanted to have this conversation is because of how frustrated, angry, and smack a motherfucker upside the head for being dumb, mad I may get thinking about how all of this just ties into the same thing. How women, we very clearly are impacted by this, even though so many women act like they're not because they so centered in maleness, or centering men, I should say. They're so centered on men that, like, doesn't really matter how they would suffer because of it. But I try to keep an open mind, even when talking about this stuff. Try to look at it like, okay, this is important to discuss. We're not going to get mad about it. But no matter how much I try, it pisses me off. So a lot of people who haven't really looked into this or thought about it before, they're kind of like, what? Because they look at marriage as something that happens for love. But the ghost of history is lingering because it's in the subtle and sometimes not so subtle expectation that a wife's career or ambitions should take a backseat to her husband. So marriage is happening for a different reason in present time, so to speak. But there's still that lingering energy because it's the foundation of the belief that a man has the right to control his partner and that her primary job is to take care of his needs. This is what this is centered in. We're in new times, but central themes still central theming that ain't really cutting it for us. But I thought about this since, I can't help but look at things, through an astrological lens. Even, as simply as possible in a way that you can understand even if you're not like all that astrologically literate. But if you know what rules what and things like that, a lot of this should make sense. So looking at the energies behind this, I want to be clear about something. When you hear me say masculine and feminine energies, I'm not talking about gender identity. I'm talking about archetypical qualities. Fire and air signs are considered projective energy. So this is the energy of initiation and act, like getting it done, right? Water and earth signs are receptive. So they sustain and nurture. The receptive energies have to receive something to do something with, rather than going out to get said things. Let us all understand in advance, all of us, Ben did content on this. If you need a reminder, you're all 12 signs. I don't care what your placements in your chart is. Your chart is the entire wheel, and the wheel has all 12 signs represented within it. But on top of that, you're a mixture of both masculine and feminine energies at different amounts and degrees, depending on what your chart looks like. But you've got it all. But what we're talking about now is that astrologically Mars rules men and therefore its home sign of Aries. So if we think of Aries energy as the archetypal male energy, so to speak, it's brash, assertive, and self-focused. But what's the highest aspiration for male energy? I mentioned this in the other video I did as well. Because in an astrological chart, the highest point, the 10th house, shows what that sign aspires to. And what's up there? Capricorn. Capricorn's an earth sign, by the way. So it's receptive and thus feminine. And it represents structure, discipline, and responsibility. So what this tells us, if we put the sign for men on the ascendant, is that the ultimate goal for projective masculine energy is to integrate the structured, responsible, receptive qualities of the feminine. I don't think y'all heard me. It also would say, if we really want to look at it even further, that unless a man is able to integrate the structured, responsible, receptive qualities of the feminine, you ain't gonna be able to take care of no woman. You're not gonna be able to be the sort of man that lets a woman even unleash those feminine parts of herself. It says so much. It really does. Now let's flip it. If we look at women, and women are represented by the moon, and the moon rules the sign of Cancer. What we have there is a receptive, nurturing water energy, okay? So we're going to do the same thing we did with the Aries energy. If we put Cancer on the ascendant and then go around the wheel, the highest aspiration for Cancer energy, what's going to show up in the 10th house of Cancer? Aries, men. The assertive, projective, and masculine energy. So, looking at it this way, first of all, that's why women will fight in public. Mars and Aries would rule that. But when you look at this holistically, it shows that there's really like a beautiful kind of cosmic balancing act, because the projective needs the receptive to give it purpose and structure. Okay, and the receptive needs the projective to initiate action and assert itself, which is one of the things that you should always think of when you think of energy. So many things are dependent on the other. There's polarity. You would not even feel joy without pain. You wouldn't ascribe qualities to joy that are actually joyful if you didn't have the other side of that coin, or the other end of that spectrum. So that's just how it goes. Now, when we think of this again, thinking about male entitlement, from this perspective, what we're discussing really is what happens when masculine projective energy refuses to mature and integrate those qualities. So what happens is it's kind of like remaining stuck in that like initial brash, self-centered Aries state. And that's a state that kind of demands that others cater to it. Because again, harkening back to the ruler of Aries being Mars, you have your first Mars return when you're around 2.5 years old. This is toddler energy, y'all. Okay? So if it don't never grow the fuck up, it literally is expecting the world to cater it. Mommy gotta feed you. You can't feed yourself. Mommy gotta take care of you. You need to be taken care of. So, that's speaking to immaturity and, remaining in that Aries state instead of aspiring to, grow up. You're supposed to be responsible for yourself. You're supposed to create your own boundaries and be able to have a handle on yourself. You're no longer, a kid whose parent is responsible for it. So you see how important it is to kind of look at it that way, astrologically. In part 2 of this discussion, we'll go even deeper into male entitlement, including societal programming for it and more. But make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you know when that episode and others are up. Peace.